Welcome back, everyone. We hope you guys are refreshed and ready for more insights and discussions. Our next panel invites our audience to think about two questions. One, what does it take to catalyze systems change? And two, what do those changes look like when it happens? In this second panel discussion, we'll be talking about field catalysts, the people and teams who mobilize and galvanize social change. Please join me in welcoming the people putting big ideas into actions. First, we have Dr. Rukmini Banerjee. She's the 2021 Yidan Prize for Education Development Laureate. She is the CEO of Pratham Education Foundation. We also have Vicky Colbert. She's the 2017 Yidan Prize for Education Development Laureate. She is the founder and director of Fundación Escuela Nueva. Wendy Kopp is a member of Yidan Council of Luminaries. She's the CEO and co-founder of Teach for All. The moderator of this panel is Dr. Laura Savage, Executive Director of the International Education Funders Group. Please join me in welcoming all of them. Welcome all. Dr. Savage, let me turn the floor over to you.
All right, welcome back, everyone. It's great to be here. And wow, have we got a panel for you right now. So I'm glad you just had that coffee to turbocharge your brains. Because what we're going to talk about now, in line with the theme that ideas can spark systems change, we're going to talk about people that spark change. And we have three incredible women here who probably don't think of themselves. I think at the start of the conversation around this panel, none of them would have, probably still today, stood up and said, I identify as a systems catalyst, as a systems changer. Maybe none of them at the start of what they did would have said, I'm setting out to change a system. But here we are today, and what we're going to do is to drill down into them, their journeys, their stories, and their advice for everyone else of us who's working in education. Because we've talked this morning about particular forms of pedagogy, a little bit about the Hong Kong education system. But on this panel today, we're going to be talking about education systems around the world that are failing. And I think at the start of this session, I want to underline how remarkable the stories you're going to hear are, because far too many systems are failing, education systems are failing too many students. And it's sometimes easy in the flow of the conversations we have in education to lose sight of the enormity of the challenge, the scale of the challenge, and the reality for too many kids in too many classrooms. So the stories we'll talk about today are ones of adversity in the hardest of settings. So we'll first hear from Rukmini, who in her leadership of Pratham, not only, grew an organization from the slums of India into becoming a global campaign for learning assessment and for teaching at the right level. From Vicky, whose work in the hardest to reach communities of Colombia showed that we can reach every child everywhere and give child-centered pedagogy to them to enable them to thrive. And then with Wendy, whose idea for a way to get the right teachers into the right classrooms at the right time is an issue that we grapple with around the world in every single education system. And this has morphed into becoming an army of education passionate champions in all sorts of careers everywhere in leadership positions. So there's a lot to get on with. And Rukmini, I'm going to turn to you first to ask you a question about where it all started. So looking back at the start of your journey with Pratham, what did you set out to do? And tell us a little bit about the moments in your journey with Pratham where it seemed overwhelming and it seemed daunting, or there seemed to be a challenge or a blockage that made you pause. And tell us a little bit about how you went over that edge.
So Laura, no pressure to just in 2 minutes explain everything that you've done in the last 20 years. But it's fantastic to be here, amazing to be here with the group as well as the people in the audience. So big thank you to Yidan for getting us all together. Looking back, I have to say that I'm beginning to sound like my elderly aunts when they used to say, when I was young, things were like this. So, but unfortunately, as you get older, when you look back, you have to say that. So when we started in Pratham in Bombay, it was called Bombay then, later it became Mumbai, I don't think there was a very big long-run plan of what we wanted to do. Our two founders, Madhav Chavan and Farida Lambe, they came up with something quite simple, saying every child in school and learning. But that at the beginning, we thought would be just some neighborhoods. And slowly that went to the city level. Bombay is a big city, many children. But I don't think there was a plan right from the beginning to say that, we have to change everything in the city. And we looked for gaps because it had a school system. The school system in Mumbai teaches in 8 languages. And I don't know how many school systems in the world in big cities do that. So we looked as ordinary people, how do we strengthen, how do we add to what is already going on? And based on some understanding of the landscape, it appeared that while we had schools from first grade onwards, there wasn't really anything much to prepare kids to enter first grade. Bombay is a city of migrants. Almost half the city lives in what we call unauthorized places. So providing services in such places is also often a little difficult because if people are not supposed to be there and you give them services, then the chances they'll never leave is also high. But what we could see was that if you had some kind of a preschool that would provide a bridge to first grade. And so if you wanted every child in school, maybe having every child in some kind of a preschool would lead every child to first grade. And then once you got into first grade, hopefully you could go on. Now, we didn't have any money. Money is always very useful. I want to let everybody know here. But sometimes when you don't have money, you scramble and you have ambition, you scramble and find something that works. So our view was that for little children, they will have to come together in small groups somewhere close to their house. And their homes are all in these slums. So you'll have to find some place right there. Bombay, I'm sure like Hong Kong, is very expensive for rent. So the question of paying rent was not even there, which meant that people have to cooperate and agree that these little kids need a place to come to. And luckily our kids are quite little, so they don't take too much space. And they're not going to be in this preschool all day. So you need kind of a place for a couple of hours a day. And for that place, I think the negotiations that happened were done by local people. Because if you wanted to have a little preschool and local people wanted to have it, then it was up to them to find the space and find the kids. So I think what we learned is that if there was something quite simple that was a gap, and you could actually make more people realize that this gap can be filled, then solutions would come from the different contexts. I remember, I know this morning we had somebody from the UN. I remember a lady from UNICEF visiting our programs. And she said, this is absolutely inappropriate for children, the places where they're learning. And I remember my saying to her, well, Bombay is a very inappropriate place for most people. But if we are already here, we may as well make the most of it. So this community-based, locally organized little space was where we began. And when I started with Pratham a few years into our existence, it was 96. And I remember we had 150 of these little preschool clusters, you may call it. And by 98, there were 3,500 of them. And this was not planned. We had no idea when we started where it would go. But it was really pushed and picked up by local, especially young women, who felt that this is something I can do in my community. So I don't know about big words like system and change, but I do think that a clear idea where you see a gap, where you're able to say we can all come together, do something quite simple, and that it will make a difference, can go a long way. Obstacles and so on, I have to think while they all talk.
Vicky, let me pose a similar question to you. Can you tell us a bit about the history of Escuela Nueva, where the idea came from, how it came to you to have the idea to reach these hardest to reach children and to take the approach to education that you did?
Well, this, first of all, Escuela Nueva, which is not so new anymore, it's one of the longest bottom-up innovations of the developing world that's still being sustained. But for us, necessity was the mother of innovation. We were forced to rethink everything because nothing worked. And we had to go into the causes, not the symptoms. So we had to really analyze what's happening to this child, where he has to repeat, he has to drop out, no learning, no results, very low self-esteem. And then, of course, you were forced to think about the role of the teacher, So what is the real role of the teacher? So we were forced to rethink everything. And this was good. I think really, as I always say, necessity is the mother of all this innovation. And we were forced to think systemically because if we wanted to go to the roots rather than the symptoms. And why so many dropouts? Why so much repetition? Why no results? And when we started looking for the whys, then we were forced to think that we had to change the way of learning. And when I was hearing this morning ICAP, I said, this is the perfect framework for what we're doing because, these ideas are not new. These ideas came in Latin America into the elite schools, but not into the low-income, far-away schools. So we had to shift the power dynamics in the classroom, in the community. So actually what we did was just shift this learning paradigm into child-centered, and especially we started with the multi-grade schools initially. We're also working in urban areas now and for displaced children. But what I think was interesting is that we had to shrink the way of learning. And it was really, we were forced into personalized learning. Not everybody learns the same thing at the same time. So it was self-paced learning. And to have self-paced learning, you have to have modules. And to have modules, you had to think of dialoguing modules, where children are really dialoguing among themselves. But not only self-paced learning, but cooperative learning, which is something that nobody talks so much about. And I think it's so important to highlight cooperative learning, where you construct knowledge together through looking into your eyes and dialoguing the right questions, the intelligent questions, because I think as Professor Bruce Albert said, I have learned from him, if you learn to write the right question, you're starting to introduce a scientific method in the learning process. And this is what we really wanted to do. So we had to change the way of working with the children, working with the teachers, working with the families and the communities to bring them into the picture. Because, I wanted to say, for example, if we didn't bring the families, they say, these children are playing, they're not learning. We never learned the way. They should be doing more and memoristic type of approaches. So we had to bring them into the picture. The most difficult all were the administrators, of course. But the issue is that we were forced to think systemically from the beginning. And I think this is a positive aspect.
Wendy, so Vicky and Rukmini have just talked about the iterative nature of their journeys. I think it's really, there are really strong echoes across what both of them have said, and this resonates with you, right? So Teach for All, for those, I'm sure everyone in the room knows Teach for All, but it is now, in 61 countries across 6 continents, and started out as a fairly simple idea of getting top graduates into teaching. But those graduates have become tightly knit communities in the different countries, and now has spurred a whole theory of people-first development. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey? The same question, 2 minutes. Tell us about a lifetime's effort.
Yes, I never could have predicted 34 years ago when I was a college senior and thought of this very simple idea that it would keep me going in the way you just described for this long. The idea was simply, there I was as a college senior feeling that our generation was just searching for something we weren't finding in terms of an opportunity to address the inequities in my country, in the United States. We were actually called the me generation. People were convinced that we all wanted to go work in banks, and I was sitting there realizing that's because It's just banks and consulting firms that are banging down our doors asking us to commit just 2 years to work in their firms. And that's what generated this idea. Why aren't we being recruited as aggressively to commit just 2 years to teach in our country's lowest income communities? And right from the start, I felt that there was a larger power. Like, we would channel all this energy into classrooms, which would make a huge difference for kids growing up today. But those 2 years, I knew those 2 years would shift everything for those teachers. You know, it would, I thought, change the priorities of a generation and the consciousness of our country. So that was the big idea. It was very quickly far beyond me. And I saw it both, I mean, I had my head down, fully focused on the US. It was never occurred to me, actually, that this might be relevant in the rest of the world. And we were pursuing this effort to make Teach for America bigger and better. And through the years, I was seeing that with enough of these folks channeling their energy into urban and rural communities, and going through the kind of transformation that led to for them, and never leaving the work, like enough of a critical mass of them, I was seeing that add up to actually changing systems. And, you know, thankfully started meeting people around the world who were just determined that something similar should happen in their countries. The first of whom was Shaheen Mistry in India, who convinced me to go to India. And I remember being on the plane just thinking, this doesn't make sense. Like, India's so different. You know, what do I have to share? But the week I spent with her now 17 years ago shifted a lot for me, because what I realized is that the circumstances that the most marginalized kids in India face were eerily similar to the circumstances the most marginalized kids in the US faced, and maybe more so than they were to the more privileged kids in their own countries. And kind of seeing the remarkable similarities led me to realize how short-sighted it would be to not pursue this effort as a global effort. And so that's what led to the launch of Teach for All, as a network of all these independent national organizations, but with an ability to enable all the staff members and teachers and alumni teachers to learn from each other across borders. And I think as we got into that, we much more quickly went up the kind of learning curve around, you know, how to develop what we've come to call the collective leadership necessary to change systems.
Wendy, to pick up on that point, and it's something that, again, both Vicky and Rukmini mentioned, the need for this sense of leadership and this sense of mission within a group of allies and catalysts across the system. Vicky, you mentioned administrators and how perhaps they're the hardest to hook into this idea. Rukmini, you talked about young women and their role in creating the both physical and, you know, sort of pedagogical space for this change to happen. But what if that's not there? You know, I think the stories that we've heard and the examples that you have all given are outliers. And that's, you know, I think there is a clamor now across the education world to learn from these examples and to replicate, yes, contextually, but to replicate. So we have a lot of literature and debate now on how to foster that sense of leadership, how to foster that sense of mission. Can it be done? And how?
First of all, I think this is such an overdue conversation in education. And I think the RISE research has put this question front and center. You know, this research that basically looked at, you know, years, like decades of data from all the low and low to middle income countries in the world to understand what is at work, where we're seeing education systems improving. And the headlines are quite depressing, because actually we haven't seen them improving in most countries. We've seen them, you know, in fact, learning levels have decreased in many countries. And it's not for lack of trying, right? Like, these governments, the World Bank, UNESCO, like, we've thrown a lot of stuff at these systems, but it hasn't generated the results that we would hope for. And I think the headline I took from the RISE research is that we spend most of our energy in education on what they call technical practices, working to do something that's very important. And they would say it's very important. We need to strengthen curriculum and assessments and teacher training and and get the buildings open and think about technology, like all these technical practices. But their research shows, to your point, that technical practices is not enough. If those technical practices are not implemented with intention towards a shared purpose of students learning and developing, it doesn't add up to progress. And so the research leaves us with that big question. How do we do that? How do we build a shared sense of purpose? And one thing I know is that it's what I've seen happen in communities all over the world through this work. So I know this is one way that we can, enlist people with a lot of passion and leadership potential in teaching in under-resourced communities, invest in their development. There's now a growing body of research that I've seen across our network. I think when we started seeing the same leadership effects all over the world, it led to this question of what is going on. And so now there's been all this research that shows the degree to which those 2 years reshaped the teachers themselves so that they believe much more in their students and in the potential in the communities in which they're working. They believe more in their own potential to make a difference. And they come to understand the complexity of the issues. So essentially, they become the leaders we need. And if you get to the point where you have enough of them, not only working in classrooms, but working in classrooms as school leaders, in government ministries, pushing on the system from the outside as advocates and social innovators, and working from the inside, then you have the kind of collective leadership that can move a system with purpose. So I think it's one of many endeavors we need, and we need much more learning on this question of what does generate the sense of purpose that will be necessary to ultimately shift systems.
I think it's a question a lot of funders are asking right now. What is the role of an external actor from a system? We're all involved in systems and no one is truly external, but what is the role of someone who is not actively working in a school to be able to create and nurture those movements? And Vicky, building on that, a similar question to you that, you mentioned in your first comments that necessity prompted every step of the Escuela Nueva journey. But also, I would imagine at every step, there were political dynamics, small p politics maybe as well as big P politics. There were political dynamics to negotiate. There were power dynamics involved at the school level as well as across the communities and indeed then national level that you've been working with. Can you tell us a little bit about how you navigated that in Colombia and maybe reflect on efforts to take Escuela Nueva to other contexts where again that sort of political dynamic is different, as Wendy mentioned?
I think when you think about systems change, not only you have to address the causes, not the symptoms, but there's a collaboration gap. And one of the causes, for example, in the coffee region of Colombia, children were repeating because they had to participate in the harvest of coffee with their parents, moving from one community to another. So why not bring the Coffee Growers Federation into this process? So, it's so boring only to talk to the Ministry of Education and the supervisor. So I said, well, they are one of the causes of the problems we're having, and they need educated citizens to increase the production of coffee in an intelligent way. So I went to the coffee growers because I was looking for other actors, other partners, a collaboration. And this has been so important because many of the best examples of Escuela Nueva are in the coffee region of Colombia. They took leadership, they took ownership, and this is what, by the way, I want to highlight Jean-Pierre, 30 years ago, World Declaration. I'm looking at Mansour, who was in UNICEF at that moment, and saying education is so important and cannot only be in the hands of government. It's a commitment for all society. So necessarily you have to bring other actors into the picture. And for us this was crucial. And it has been so significant because we had to have, support a new way of collaboration. So I think this is crucial that we just go beyond education systems and look for other partners.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that particular moment when you realized it is the coffee plantations, the guys that run them, that need to get involved, and then how you did it? Because again, I often hear you speak about the Escuela Nueva journey, and every step sounds so intuitive and so natural, and yet it's a journey that others around the world have not taken.
Well, it's just that we have to see that education is a commitment of all society. It's not only of the education system, which is the one that least changes in relation to other systems. So it was so important that the coffee growers would see, that if they don't have educated citizens, their coffee production is not going to be working. So we just made them aware of the situation and brought them into the picture. And they've just developed so many innovations from the original initiated dimensions we had. So it's just working to bring other partners into the whole process. Now, definitely of course, for us in Latin America, teachers' colleges are a complication because we have to change them in many dimensions. Teachers themselves have never been exposed to active learning themselves. So how are you expect that they make the change if they were trained in a different way? Things like this, things that are so simple. And so this is why we had to start with, this is still a challenge. This is still a challenge, but we had to change the way of working with the teachers, that they were trained with the same methodology, that when you're working with attitudes and behaviors, visual images help teachers, that they would see a school in action to say, we can do that. But the other thing was not to leave them alone. So we accompanied them through a community of practice, which is so significant, so important, because teachers learn more from other teachers than from advisors and experts. So it was just learning, all these dimensions. And by the way, I always highlight Charles Leadbeater from the UK. He says that the majority of the innovations come from the South. So I think we should start looking more into the South.
I'm going to come back to that point you made about networks and communities of practice, because I think, again, that's something that echoes across the systems change stories here. But Rukmini, first, on the point that Vicky made around changing attitudes, changing mindsets, Pratham's done that in two incredible ways that have led to movements around the world, right? Starting in India and then building outwards. First, around shining a spotlight on learning, which, again, at the start of ASA, was not necessarily something that you could have foreseen, right? That building a slow focus on quite how low learning levels were and are, and repeating that citizen-led assessment year on year, that's now become a global network of citizen-led assessments around, around the world. And that has changed the mindsets of politicians and parents. Well, that's a question. Has it changed the perspective of politicians and parents? The second movement that Pratham has been a part of spurring is the teaching at the right level. The phrase that whenever I talk to someone who's not from education, you say, oh, this is something that we should do. And they go, oh, finally someone talks to us in plain English about what it is that we need to do, because it's so intuitive and yet so difficult, arguably, to do in the classroom. Can you tell us a bit more about how and whether you think those mindsets have changed, and what advice you would give to others who are trying to prompt mindset and behavior change in those key actors, politicians, parents, and practitioners?
So I think I think we share a lot of common things, and every time I hear them speak, I feel we should write something together. So let's say, before I talk about ASAR or teaching at the right level, a big mindset shift that happened in our early days in the slums of Bombay was that just an ordinary young woman in the slum saw somebody else who was doing this, her friend, in the next slum, and felt, geez, I can do this as well. This does not have to come with a degree and a certification. People would often ask us, how do you recruit people into Pratham? I said, I've never recruited anybody. They come and say, I'm going to do it. Are you going to be with me or not? So you have a choice there to say, no, I won't help you, or I will, right? And so it wasn't like this massive spread in a short period of time happened by some recruitment and design. And I mean, I shouldn't say this in such a big hall and some big theory of change, but it happened because you saw people like yourselves moving forward, and you thought, just like Vicky said or Wendy said, if she can do it, I can do it too, and let me start. And I think that's what is kind of snowballs into a, movement may be a very big word, but a big move to make something happen quickly. I'll come back to the two questions you asked, but I don't know about other countries. In India, when people on TV are asked a question, they just go ahead and say whatever they want. And so true to my Indian tradition, I will say some things which she didn't ask me. But I think the word, like for example, there's a lot of talk about systems change. And the word in English makes some sense and probably has some shared meaning. But we've been thinking about how do you say systems in many of our Indian languages. And there isn't a special word. It's sort of like the way of the world, and how do you change it? And so I think we need to think about how this process of change is perceived by people who are part of the change, who will, I think, probably agree with me that you take one step, you feel it's like cooking, you cook a dish that you heard from someone else or tasted somewhere else, and then you cook it and your whole family says this is not tasty, then you try again, and then you try again, and at some point it becomes good enough to tell other people about. So this process of trying and trying, how do you capture that? Let me come to Asar and to teaching at the right level. So in this whole spread of this early years work that we did, several things happened. One was that other places said maybe this combination of working in the community and collaborating with the schools can work in other places. So there was a geographical kind of a spread. But the other thing was parents said, you're doing a lot for these little ones, but I have kids who are not in school, or I have kids who are in school, but they're not doing what we think ought to happen. But since I'm not very educated, I can't say what that is. But there was a general discomfort that, and of course it's always tagged to, oh, these children are migrants, these children are poor, so how will they catch up, and so on. So there was, by the time 2000 came around, I mean, there was, I think, universal agreement that children need to be in school. More and more children were in school. Even as early as, early 2000s, 90% plus of Indian children were attached to some school. But and that was visible, and it was very tangible, and people could, relate to it. But this discomfort, there was something happening which was not quite right, and our own view was that because we were now working with kids who were in school by this time, how do we put how do we describe what is going on? And I remember, long back, that we would try to say, how do I describe you? I'm having trouble teaching you, but how do I get a hang of you? And it's not only you, there's lots of kids. And we figured quite early that if you can't read, you really can't do anything else. So if it is reading, then what shall I do? And a common layman view would be, can you read letters? Can you read words? Can you read a couple of sentences? And can you read more? So we started with that, and there was a bunch of our colleagues working in different places. And I think that helped us form a vocabulary of what we were doing. So if you have a child who can't read letters, and that child is already in 5th grade, I can't use the 5th grade textbook to do anything. And if I give him the 1st grade textbook, he's going to be a little bit disappointed. And everybody will be, because I've come to 5th grade much further than anybody else in my family. So we developed something that we felt worked with us, where all children got a little story. And the little story was for everyone. It didn't have a grade name on it, but it had large font and it had simple words. And we started working to see how long would it take my group of kids, who may be either all at the same level, very low, or all mixed up, to move from letters to words to, and there was a lot of talk, is this phonetic approach, balanced approach. There was a lot of theory around that. But I think for us, what was important is that we had a common vocabulary. We could see what kinds of activities kids could engage with, and our people who were teaching could engage with. I realized this morning that much of it was not passive. It was active and maybe beyond, because kids were then creating meaning out of it. So 2 things happened. One is, there was a way to describe what was bothering us, and the way to describe it was quite simple. My purse is over there, otherwise I would show you the simple tool, which is just literally, can you read letters? Can you read words? Can you read stories? And we also had a lot of experience growing in different contexts and different languages, but how long it would take if you were 7 or 8 to go from being able to read letters to be able to really read a story. So I think that the whole journey, one branch went into ASER, the Annual Status of Education Report, which did this first in village communities, then in slightly larger places, and then by 2005 became a national effort. But alongside that, there was a solution that at least we felt we could provide as you saw the problem. You know, it's focusing a lot of light on a problem without a possible solution can sometimes be quite demotivating. And therefore, to understand the problem, according to me, is halfway to the solution. And therefore, while you show out a problem, if you're able to say, look, I have one solution, there could be many more solutions, I think it goes a longer way. So this ASER report has been done. It's done in every district in India. It's done by local people in that district. It was very odd in the beginning that you could do assessment that was not pen and paper, that was not set on grade level, that was not set by experts. But this is something simple which rose from the ground that people could understand. And therefore, I think, again, it was a gap that came, you know, at sort of the, if you play tennis, there's a sweet spot. Or if you play cricket, there's a sweet spot. It hit the sweet spot. And therefore, it was very simple. Therefore, involving people was easy. So every district basically does a sample-based assessment. The sampling is decided from before. But it's important for local people to own that. Because the more you do this stuff, the more you realize when you actually assess a child that just a little nudge is going to take them further. This isn't a whole big thing. And so I would say that the ASER report year on year has brought this to the notice, not just of the government, but of everyone. You know, the media, you know, everybody in the country. And the teaching at the right level, which is a name in English that we are not sure who gave, but we think it's JPAL, who've evaluated us a lot. In India, we call it Kamal. Now, Kamal in many Indian and South Asian languages means wonder or amazement. Because you're going to take kids who for 5 years in school have not learned, and then in 50 days, 60 days, are going to be reading. So it's like magic, and you want the system and everybody who's in it and parents to believe that magic is possible. So I think these are universal problems. The fact that it has gone to other countries is just because this is not a uniquely Indian problem. And I think the solution, people have modified some of these solutions, but I think these are very simple things. And this morning, somebody was talking about quality of education being relative. And I feel like, no, there are certain things which every child must have. Because as soon as you learn to read, your back becomes straight, your eyes become, you are able to look into other people's eyes. It's not only about reading, it is about confidence in yourself that you can learn. And that's not relative, that's an absolute. And every child must get it.
I want to pick up on what Rukmini is saying. We wish we would have that type of assessment in Colombia, but at least something that is so important is to have evidence. Evidence and empirical research findings behind. I think that was, for us, was crucial because, you know, we always, when Colombia started having such good results in rural schools compared to urban schools, except to the mega cities, but, you know, also responding to the issue of equality and equity, equality and equity, you know, then many countries started to come to see what we were doing. And this sort of helped the self-esteem. Self-esteem of children, self-esteem of teachers, self-esteem. We've been measuring self-esteem since 40 years ago, because that for us was the first thing. If you don't have a strong self-esteem, you will not flourish. So this was crucial. And of course, in Latin America, we produce more poetry than science. So we had to learn that in order for other people to believe us, we would have to publish first at the University of London so that the Colombians could understand us and believe us, but especially not only on cognitive achievement, but on peaceful social interaction of children in Colombia. And this is so important. This is crucial. And I just wanted to highlight the importance of the self-esteem and of measurement, which is crucial. And you know, when the Vietnamese picked up Colombia's Escuela Nueva, and you know, and they have implemented in all Vietnam, then the Colombians say, what do you mean? You know, what do you mean the Vietnamese are implementing Escuela Nueva in all their territory? And we still haven't done it yet. No. So I think this is something that we have to learn from, the importance of having international research backing you up, and also, you know, and to start building these types of initiatives and bottom-up approaches.
I think one key takeaway for me from this conversation is that there's a book coming out from these three ladies called Magic is Possible. But I do want to ask you, we've got some great questions coming in from the audience, but I want to ask you one question, the same question to each of you looking forward. What is the change in the system? So the system, and I agree, Rukmini, I mean, even in English, there is no, I think the word system is interpreted in mostly too linear a fashion, and it does mean something different. I prefer the translation that you gave. But looking at the system that you've been working in, what needs to happen next? What is the next big challenge that you foresee? Wendy, let me come to you first.
What's most on my mind, just listening to my colleagues here, is actually, I'm going to pick up on the need for learning among the adults in the system. Like, we don't do that well. And so I could not agree more with Vicki when she says, you know, they saw the need for collaboration. I mean, I still remember reflecting back, I'd become obsessed with this idea that with enough leadership, you can change any system. You know, like, over time, I'd come to realize that, like, in any kind of ecosystem, you know, if you have enough of a critical mass of people throughout, I mean, even, you know, who is that union leader, and towards what purpose are they working? You know, who are the people on the school board? We could elect new school board members depending on your country. Like, with enough people, we can get where we need to be, until I realized it's not true. Like, because I saw certain communities where there were, in fact, an absolute critical mass of leaders on the same mission who were very diverse. That was the other thing I'd become obsessed about. Like, they must be diverse. Like, yes, we need the people with the privilege, and if we don't have a whole bunch of leaders who themselves experience the inequities we're addressing, it will not be sustainable, and we will not get as far as we're trying to go. But then I realized even those two things are not enough. All those people in the puzzle have to be able to step up from their individual pursuits into a shared space and build relationships and have debates and learn together, or we won't move the system as much as it has the potential to go. I mean, it's all of those things together that we came to call collective leadership, like when we have enough people throughout the ecosystem who are diverse and locally rooted, and who have the space among them to work together, to collaborate, to learn together. And at the same time, I've seen, this is true across borders, I mean, to the point about you just need to see, like, someone doing something to realize, oh, we could do that too. I cannot tell you, I mean, we are by and large looking at a whole bunch of folks all across the world who believe that their community is the end of the world, right? Like, when we can pull people up and expose them to local leaders tackling very similar issues, like expanding opportunity for the most marginalized kids, and so that they can learn from each other, we've just seen truly transformational power from that kind of learning. So I think personally, like, I think about the Yidan commitment to tackling education as a global matter as truly game-changing. We don't have enough folks who realize the power we have to accelerate progress through developing global learning systems that enable practitioners in communities across the world to actually learn together and with each other, and how much potential that has to accelerate progress.
For us, a big challenge is, and we've done mainly in-service training of teachers and demonstrated that, yes, you can make changes. But now I think a big challenge is getting into faculties of education and teachers' colleges. I mean, this is the challenge for us right now, how to start getting inside these colleges and shaping the way teachers are trained within these colleges and institutions. So I think this is the big challenge for us, because, you know, since the beginning, if that's where they're coming out, why don't we challenge this? And, you know, and I was just visiting, for example, a wonderful experience in Brazil that we had the opportunity to visit. And the first things I asked everybody was, did you learn anything of this in your teacher's college? No, no. So this is something that I think we, in education systems, we have to learn how to tackle with and how to get into and how to attract them to introduce changes, especially when you have demonstrated that it can be done.
Do you know, that's a topic that at this year's RISE conference, the research program that Wendy referenced, there was a whole day on teaching and how to get the right teachers into the right classrooms at the right time. And every single study was a story of failure. Every single study was that teacher training didn't happen right, or we didn't attract the right teachers, or deployment got, you know, there was too many went to the urban areas rather than the rural, or indeed the battle between the focus on foundational learning was at odds with those working on higher education and teacher training colleges. But one of the stories that I think has been really promising and really heartening in the last year has been that from Sierra Leone. And I think there are some people from Sierra Leone here today, although unfortunately Minister Senge couldn't come. But he, when he was Minister of Education, obviously a huge champion for foundational learning, was in a conversation with his colleague, Minister for Higher Education. And a lot of people posed the question to the Minister of Higher Education and said, do you feel challenged by the fact that your country has stood up and said, we are prioritizing the reading of 10-year-olds over, ostensibly, the education of teenagers or the education of adults? And the Minister for Higher Education said no, because my role is to make sure the right teachers are teaching those kids. And so there is engagement of adults, and it comes back to the point you were making, Wendy. You know, it's about engaging those adults who are going to become teachers, but also those who are going through the higher education process to become education champions across the system and across the economy. But Rumini, what is, from your perspective, the next big challenge we have in education?
So, you know, the word pratham means primary. So I can't say anything beyond primary, because it looks to me sometimes that that world is quite fraught. But I would say that in the preschool and all the way to, say, you know, 10 or 11, many important things have happened in the last 20 years. Firstly, we have, to a large extent, got many kids into school. So in a country like India with 250 million children, this is not a small thing. And there are lessons from these big moves. The lesson I take from that big move is that everybody helped. The government made schools, the parents wanted the children to go in, neighbors said, why the hell aren't you in school, come on. So I think you need to build that kind of a, you know, a support of everyone, so that every child in school and learning well belongs to everyone. So that's number one. I think there are examples of how it can be done. It's now a question of how do you implement it and keep at it, because there isn't one solution. Even when we did schooling, you have to do a bunch of different things. You have to have some local stuff. Second thing I think is that, you know, this is a bad, I don't know what to say in English, metaphor or whatever. To fight a war, at least until recently, now maybe there are new ways of fighting wars, you needed an army, you needed a navy, and you needed an air force. Now, I feel the army has been around. There's been different ways. We've been talking about some of those. But I think another big learning from all of us is there are many more people who can be in your army if you invite them in. Whether they are the, you know, top level students in the US, or the coffee growers, or in our case, the slum women, if you open the door and say, I want your help, people will come in. So we have to learn that everything doesn't happen in those teacher training colleges. Open the door, there is a lot of learning to be happening elsewhere. And again, for countries like India, I think there are demographic waves that you have to ride. So 2 demographic waves that we see, that we feel all strategies should move towards, is we have a massive young population. That massive young population should have a very positive experience while they're still young. because that will give you the fuel for their later development to say, as a 17-year-old, I helped the kids in my village learn. And therefore, I'm a very capable person and I can do many things, afterwards. We have young mothers, mothers of our preschool children, who are beneficiaries of the last 15 years of universalizing elementary education. For a variety of reasons, our labor force participation for women is low, which means there are women with children at home, high aspiration, some schooling. You have to ride on it. They can be huge source of support to the work that we are doing. Now, the Air Force is important as well. Many of these things have been happening. 2020, India had a new education policy. The policy document is some 50, 60 pages long. But to be very honest, I haven't gone beyond page 8. Because on page 8, it says in a nice big box, and I don't know who wrote it. I mean, we have many people in the country. Some very smart people who've had their eyes on the ground probably wrote it. It says that if children do not read and do basic arithmetic by grade 3, the rest of this policy is irrelevant. We've never had such a strong, high priority at the policy level in front of us. And it goes ahead to say, we've got to get this done in the next 5 years. Next 5 years, whenever you start counting the 5 years from, is well before 2030. And I know there are a lot of influential people in this audience. We have to make that kind of a statement for our sustainable development goals to say if across the world, children don't learn these basic things by 3rd, 4th, even 5th grade, forget about any other future. Having said that, I also think that we should be ready for success. I think we are often very mired in things that haven't worked. But I don't know 20 years ago if people who were in rooms like this were prepared for the fact that every child may be in school. So I think we have to be prepared that what if all children learn to read? What are we going to do with them next? Because I don't think our current curriculum, the way our schools are organized, are ready for many of the things we've heard from the morning. So ride your advantage. If possible, get a policy like my page 8, put it up on every billboard in the country, and then go for it.
So there's a great question that's come in from the audience that I think picks directly up from that, which is, what was an assumption that you or someone you met along your journey had that was hardest for you to change? And Rukmini, I think there's often an assumption in education that learning takes time. Be patient, and we can't be patient, There is an urgency, but is that pick up on that question if you want to answer it.
So I think as, cultures which have not had much formal education, we have great faith and belief in books. So for us, curriculum is a big god. You cannot fuss with the curriculum. And there's a belief that if you take this step-by-step curriculum, you will get there, which you did for 20% of the kids. So I think one of the assumptions is that step aside, try something new, try it, only then you'll believe it. I think that's a big one. And the way we've learned to crack it is to say, the world is full of skeptics. So, let me go with your skepticism. All I ask is spend the next 2 to 3 weeks working with the kids in the way I'm talking about. And then let's come back and talk. Without fail, it works because children do learn if you start at their level. And the system, the curriculum, the way schools are organized prevents them from doing that. And I think that these leaders of practice, I think we're all talking about this, these leaders of practice will change, and these leaders of practice, if they are within the system. So we work a lot with whoever the system chooses to be the leader of instructional programs in the district, take them out of colleges, take them out of their offices, put them in the classroom and in the community and say, 3 weeks. I will work with you for 3 weeks. At the end of it, if you think it's hokey, we walk away. It has never happened. In 3 weeks, especially kids who are 7, 8 and older, will change if you work with them at the right level. And I think we should add what Vicky's teachers do is, and give them a hug every day. They will go ahead.
Education results take time, and they don't coincide with the political momentums. Okay, this is a big problem. So here's where you need other actors into the picture to hold the baby, when there's a shift in the powers of the Ministry of Education. So here is where definitely you have to have other partners on the ground. And I always say, I have repeated this so many times, you have to work with governments to have impact and coverage. But you need public-private partnerships and the role of civil society for two key words: quality and sustainability. Those are crucial. You have to bring other actors into the picture, because just working with the ministries of education is not enough. Now, in Latin America, 40% of children in 4th grade do not understand what they read. So now that there's more evidence, when we started, we didn't have that evidence for reading and writing in the 1st grade or 2nd grade. Now we've learned that there is evidence. And I think it's just important to push decision-making based on evidence. And we have to focus a lot on learning to read and write in Latin America.
Okay, biggest, most tough to overcome assumption that for 34 years, every single day I run into, is the idea that what we should be doing in education is looking for the thing that is going to solve this problem. It's the pervasive assumption in philanthropy and in all those multilaterals. We are looking for the intervention that can show a 0.2 plus standard deviation advance. We're going to find it. All the smart people over here, we're going to find it, and then we're going to spread it across. That has not gotten us where we are trying to go. And I think we need to shift that paradigm towards a people-first paradigm, where we're thinking much more about how to invest in the agency and the leadership of people in the developing contexts where we want to see progress, so that those folks can adapt and invent and continuously improve over time. There's a place for interventions, and we've heard a number of them here, and they're invaluable and they can spread, but only in the hands of people who are on a mission to get somewhere in their local context. So we just need to rebalance our energy, and the problem is it takes time, and it's messy, and it's hard. But the longer we keep trying to look for the simple answer that's going to get us measurable results in 3 years, the longer we defer the really hard work that will ultimately build high capacity, locally led efforts to actually improve outcomes for kids.
To take that one step further, will we end up with everyone? I kind of feel we're at this point already. Everyone is looking for who those local champions are around the world, right? Who are the people who can then drive the change. And how do we find them? How do we support them? If there isn't one single solution, how do we get away from 1,000 flowers blooming and some of them blooming in entirely the wrong directions? Because there is this sort of juxtaposition in education right now, right? Where on the one hand, there is a drive for some sense of cohesion. We all need to recognize that kids, in many contexts, including those that surprise us, right? There are kids in the US, in the UK, who cannot read and who have been in school for years. There are contexts across Asia, across Latin America, not only Africa, where 9 out of 10 kids in a primary school system cannot read. So there is, on the one hand, this sense that we need a cohesion of effort and sense of common purpose that is really hard to achieve in order to drive this change. But on the other hand, there is I guess one of the extensions of the argument that there is no single solution is that you can end up with a cacophony of efforts and a cacophony of iterative efforts where many of them will fail. And coming back to the point around urgency, we don't have the time to fail. So what would you say is the right way to achieve the balance in order to drive that education change, but in a way that doesn't cohere around this one idea of a solution.
I think if you see any school or community where you're seeing progress, anyone in those pictures will be the first to say, this isn't about any one thing. This is about, 101% solutions, right? It takes many things to actually meet the diverse needs of kids and move them forward holistically to be the leaders we need, right? So I think we need to start believing more. I mean, what I've seen is we underestimate the people in developing contexts. Like, we completely underestimate, and we need to start recognizing that the only path to the sustainable kind of multifaceted efforts that we need to see are the people in those contexts. Like, they will need to drive the change. So I think we can experiment with all sorts of things. I mean, I've seen in now, communities across 61 countries and growing, just how much potential there is. And I mean, our work is one strategy of saying, we're gonna recruit a group of change agents who are gonna start working in communities, and over time end up, like, not even in too much time, working throughout an ecosystem in partnership with many others in communities, and ultimately they kind of help infect the whole community so that everyone's on this same mission and are in fact taking on the multiple kinds of changes that need to happen if we're really going to get where we need to be.
I mean, I think that one of the problems about education is that, 100 things need to be done. However, I think it's also time to take some hard choices. Again, I can speak for India. Today, in 3rd grade in India, according to our USER data, 70% of kids are not at grade level. Nothing is going to be possible for them after this. I cannot give up on 70% of kids before they've reached age 10. The future of our country, no matter what the future is, depends on this. And therefore, I would say that, that's the reason that our air cover, the policy, is very important, because it's now there as the national goal. I really think that these kinds of national goals are absolutely important. And I worry a little bit, and there are people who are much more sophisticated than me here, that when you put this as a global goal, as a 4.1.1a, it'll be lost in, I don't know how many other goals there are. Why is this not the most important thing that every education system has to get done? Because many more things will become possible if we do that. It is also the source of the biggest inequality. And we are allowing that inequality to be in place before kids even turn 10. So to me, it seems like, I'm sure the world is a complex place, but you've got to have a very clear goal. The pathway to the goal may be very different, and different people will try different things. But you can't have 183 goals and expect that anybody will reach, any of them. And I really want whoever is here to say that, we shouldn't make it, the MDGs said, get everybody in school. It was easy for everyone to understand. 4.1.1a, for which we apparently don't have good enough evidence, but we feel it every day in our lives, everywhere, has to be highlighted. And we don't have much time left. There's 7 years before this thing will lapse, and then we'll say, oh, as a globe, we failed. I mean, that's terrible.
5 years for India, though, not 7, right? So 5 years on page 8. Do you think India will do it?
I think that the focus in India right now is on the 1st and 2nd grade, and for the first time, our policy has brought in early childhood into this continuum. These are big steps. And I would say that, obviously there are variations across, but there is a lot of energy currently going into this. The energy often goes, at least in the beginning, in the ways that we know how to do, which is inputs. Put in more materials, put in more teacher training, but hopefully soon we'll start looking at the effectiveness of what our efforts are. But I would say that between COVID and schools being closed for 2 years, between the fact that in the pandemic, lots of people came forward to help, and a new education policy, I mean, I'm very hopeful that, in my lifetime, not much left, we'll see some big change, because at least everybody now knows there's a common goal and you have to chase it. So if you're not chasing it, it's like when 20 years ago you met kids at the traffic lights, and you'd say, why aren't you in school? They'd say, I'll go tomorrow. There's a norm that you have to create. And if you create that norm, people will move towards it in their own way.
I do also think it's important that as we work towards crucial goals like that, we're doing it knowing that our purpose is bigger than that. And I do worry that we're in a bit of a false debate that could take us to where the US is, which is massive backlash. I mean, there was such a focus on foundational learning, not enough progress, and a huge backlash from people within communities who are saying low-level learning, which I know is not our definition of foundational learning, is not enough. And in fact, we've kind of taken away the agency of kids. So I think if we're all rooted in the big ideas that we heard earlier today, that we need to reshape the world through what goes on in our classrooms and be sure that what we're doing is developing students as the leaders we need with the agency and the awareness and the sense of empathy and all, and the kind of academic mastery and problem solving and critical thinking skills that will be crucial. Like, I think we need the world's educators, and that's what's going to recruit the world's educators and keep them in it, right? Like, that is, what could be more important than reshaping the world through what is happening in our classrooms? So I just think we need to stay rooted in that big purpose as we pursue, crucial shorter-term goals as well.
I wanted to share another dimension. In Latin America, we're very ideological, and unions are very strong in Latin America. So you have to learn how to work with them. In our case, since the teachers were the actors of change, we're part of the actors of change, you just have to make sure that whole concept of social participation is embedded in anything you do. If we had not brought the teachers in, at this moment, the teachers' unions, even in Colombia, are supporting Escuela Nueva. So that's good because, where there's change of governments and everything, then you have a movement type of support from the teachers because they are the actors of change. Change doesn't take place at the ministry level, it takes place at the bottom.
So you've all spoken about this idea of networks and of communities of practice and the need for alliances and relationships, dynamics. And in a way, I think when we talk about systems change, it is about moving beyond the inputs and the structures, the technical know-how. That's one of the most frustrating things of all of this point 1.1a, right, is that we know how to teach kids to read. This should not be a revolutionary thing that we're still doing research on around the world. But it is about, the word system is much more about the relationships and the dynamics that drive to the change. As a final question coming in today, can you just maybe give some reflection on how across your careers you have, and I think what's really notable in the answers that you've all given today is that you've all said we far more than I, and I think that's really powerful. But how have you built and sustained these partnerships with the diverse stakeholders? Was it intentional? Vicky, you've spoken a little bit about this, but Wendy, did you imagine that the networks of teachers that would emerge? You've spoken a lot about leadership, but give us some kind of closing reflections on the power of collaboration of communities of practice and what we all, I mean, this is a community here today from around the world, what we can all do to sustain that and to sustain that movement going forward. Let's go first.
I intuitively, since I've said that, to reach systems change, there's a collaboration gap. But you have to learn how to collaborate since you're in school. And this is so important. So this is for us, cooperative learning was crucial. That people start feeling they're working as teams. And, just thinking about the future of 21st century skills in the future, I think the most important one that probably robots will not achieve is learning to work in teams. And I think this is a big challenge.
Yeah.
And that has to be started and embedded since school.
I guess I think about it both at a local level, like thinking about our work to change education systems, our collective work, and also at a global level. And at a local level, you know, just even reflecting on the way you worded the question, Laura, I think we've made a huge progress somehow in recent years, because for years I felt like every time someone said system change, they meant policy change.
Yes.
And in education, if what we're talking about is the kind of change that changes aggregate outcomes for kids, policy change alone has no chance, right? Like, we would need to change policy and practice and culture, and that is a whole different matter, right? And it will rely on a lot of people working together. It will rely on the people in the ministry having relationships with people in the classrooms and school leaders and people inside and outside the system. So us, you know, the folks in local communities thinking about how do we foster those networks? How do we create the space that enables the relationship building and the collective learning will be really crucial. But I can't resist, I mean, since we are in a global forum, we've just underinvested in education in kind of global learning systems, right? Like in healthcare, in the environment, we've invested so much in global learning systems. You know, we all know our fates are interconnected, the solutions are shareable, and so we invest a lot in enabling all those folks in different countries to learn from each other. It's actually also true in education. Our fates are completely interconnected. The kind of education taking place in countries around the world will ultimately impact all of us. And what we've seen in our work is that the solutions are much more shareable than we've ever assumed. Always there's the need for local adaptation and cultural, you know, context, but the roots of the issues are so similar that the principles can be shared across borders. And we just need more investment in enabling that. How do we create the systems that enable all those local leaders and practitioners, not only the policymakers, but the teacher leaders, the school leaders, the kind of advocates and civic leaders to actually gain access to each other's insights and learnings? I think that needs to take much greater priority than it has to this point.
Can I just give a little example? This last summer of 2023, there was something that happened in India whose roots go back to January. So January was when the annual Status of Education report, the first one after COVID, came out. And of course, like everywhere else, you could see big learning drops. As I said, the Indian government, the states are focusing a lot on the early grades. So we had a thought that if you talk to people about the fact that kids who are in 2020, in the last school year, in 5th grade will now go to 6th grade, primary to middle school. And in primary, we know in 5th grade, under normal circumstances, about 50% of kids are not even at 2nd grade level. So year after COVID, you know, it's still really bad. So we took this report, and this just this simple finding. We picked 3 states, just because these are 3 big states in the heartland of India: Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh. Together, they are about 165 districts out of our some 700. And there was a conversation at every district level to say, we recognize what the schools are doing, but in the summer holidays, can we as people do something to help our 5th graders go to 6th grade a little bit stronger? We were completely taken aback by how quickly different people, district administrations, teacher training colleges, high schools, you know, scouts, you know, everybody said, this little thing I think we can do. A month in the summer, 2 hours in the morning, we can do it. But it needs to be very simple, because there cannot be a massive training program for this. Governments came onto this campaign, because like everybody else, we asked the government as well. And 300,000 young people, 10th grade or above, said we are willing to do this. And I sometimes wonder if we had started it a month earlier, the numbers may have doubled. Governments backed these. They didn't lead it, they backed it. Because in the summer, usually, I mean, no teachers were involved. There were youth volunteers, but many schools played a role. So for example, middle schools looked for their alumni, good alumni who could help the incoming cohort come in better. 3.5 million children were covered in this. Now, what is this? Is this, I mean, it's clearly a very big collaboration. Is it episodic? There was data that was collected. Every young person actually uploaded their baseline and endline data. Whether the data was right or wrong, there was a massive spread of some digital skills which will help the young people go forward. Now, an episode like this opened huge opportunities around. One, all kinds of unlikely people worked together, so they began to have faith with each other. We had a big participation of our rural livelihoods missions. We have big organized self-help groups for women. And in my own home state, out of the 100,000 volunteers, 45,000 came from the women's self-help groups. Now, I think these are the kinds of things that when you do one step, 3 more steps become possible. If we had talked about it in theory, I don't know how many people would have. But as everybody took these steps together, and did it in different ways in different states and different districts, but the goal was, I don't want my 5th grader to go into 6th grade feeling inadequate. So what can I do? So I would say that it's you know, development is not one big explosion. It will be big steps, learnings, going back, going forward, and that's the way we will move.
Thank you so much for sharing your learnings, all 3 of you, with us here today. And can we give them a huge round of applause? Thank you.